The Arctic sky was gray the morning they set out. A soft wind tugged at the rigging of the USS Jeanette, and the water outside San Francisco Bay shimmered in the sunlight. On deck, sailors bustled with energy, unaware that this would be the last time they'd see open ocean for nearly 2 years. The crowd on shore cheered and waved as the vessel disappeared over the horizon, bound for a world none of them could truly imagine. It was July 8th, 1879, and they were chasing the top of the earth. Captain George Washington DeLong stood at the rail, scanning the vastness ahead. He was a man of discipline and purpose, hardened by naval command and driven by something deeper than ambition. To reach the North Pole was more than glory. It was a legacy. He believed, as many did at the time, in the theory of the open polar sea, a supposed warm ocean that lay beyond the wall of ice. If one could break through the frozen barrier, smooth sailing would follow all the way to the pole. It was a fantasy. But in 1879, no one had proved it wrong. The USS Jeanette was once a British ship called the Pandora, but she had been purchased and refitted for the harshest conditions imaginable. Her hull was reinforced to resist ice. Her decks were stocked with scientific instruments, charts, rations, and the kind of optimism only found in men who hadn't yet known real suffering. 33 souls were aboard when she left San Francisco. They were a mix of sailors, engineers, scientists, and even journalists. Among them was Chief Engineer George Melville, a fiercely competent man who would later prove essential to survival. There was also Jerome Collins, an Irish journalist and weather observer whose idealism masked the storm he'd endure. Their benefactor, James Gordon Bennett Jr., the eccentric millionaire publisher of the New York Herald, had financed the voyage in hopes of glory for the paper, and perhaps himself. For Bennett, this was spectacle. For DeLong, it was destiny. The Jeanette steamed west across the Pacific, stopping in Hawaii, then Yokohama, and finally Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. From there, she passed through the Bering Strait and entered the Chukchi Sea. The Arctic welcomed them with a deceptive calm. Icebergs floated lazily at first, as if merely observing their arrival. Seals blinked in the distance. The horizon was a pale, endless plain of cold. But as they pushed further north, that stillness hardened into something more sinister. By September of that year, the ship was surrounded. Ice closed in like a slow-moving predator, its jagged teeth grinding against the hull. At first, DeLong believed they could wait it out. The Jeanette was built for this, after all. But days became weeks, then months. They weren't trapped temporarily. They were caught, locked in a frozen vice that would hold them for nearly 2 years. The ship drifted westward, encased in a vast sheet of Arctic pack ice. It was no longer under her own power. She moved only when the ice moved. The men tried to maintain routine. They rose each morning, performed duties, took scientific readings, and kept journals. DeLong enforced a strict discipline. Uniforms were to be kept clean. Duties rotated. Worship services were held. He knew idleness would lead to despair. Outside, the pressure on the ship intensified. The ice groaned and heaved, splintering and cracking with deafening force. Men would bolt upright in their bunks at the sound, waiting for the fatal shudder that would mean the hull had given way. But the Jeanette held. For a time. Inside, they kept warm as best they could. They hunted seals and polar bears when possible, supplementing their rations. But the cold was unrelenting. Frostbite claimed toes, then fingers. A man could die of exposure within minutes if he ventured too far without protection. Isolation bore down on them with a weight heavier than the ice. Time began to unravel. The sun vanished in long stretches. Men marked the weeks not by calendars, but by the waxing and waning of madness. It wasn't until June 12, 1881, nearly 2 years after they had been locked in, that the pressure became too much. The ice crushed the Jeanette's hull like it was paper. The ship groaned, splintered, and began to flood. DeLong gave the order to abandon ship. They scrambled to retrieve supplies, sledges, boats, anything that might keep them alive. And then the Jeanette, their only refuge in a frozen hell, slipped beneath the surface. They were now alone on the ice. What followed was a march that would stretch the very limits of human endurance. With hundreds of miles between them and the Siberian coast, the men began hauling their boats and supplies across the shifting, broken ice. Progress was excruciating. They crossed pressure ridges taller than buildings, crevasses hidden beneath snow, and endured gales that stripped the warmth from their bones. One of the first to die was William Lee, a fireman. He collapsed from exhaustion and cold, and they buried him in the ice. Others would follow. John Cole, another sailor, went mad from frostbite and hunger. He had to be tied down before death claimed him. Yet the group pressed on, driven by some primal instinct to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. They eventually reached the Lena Delta on the Siberian coast in late September, splitting into 3 groups to navigate separate boats down the river channels toward what they hoped were settlements. One of the groups, under Lieutenant Charles Chipp, vanished entirely, presumed lost at sea. Melville's group found safety with native Yakut villagers, who took them in and offered what little they had. But DeLong's group had landed far to the north, cut off from help, with dwindling supplies and frostbitten limbs. As his men collapsed one by one, DeLong wrote in his journal with failing hands. His final entry was dated October 30th. It read simply, "Boyd and I finished the pemmican, have just enough strength to crawl out and die." When Melville and his Yakut guides returned weeks later, they found a scene frozen in horror. The bodies of DeLong and his men lay scattered in the snow. He was found sitting upright, as though still writing. Around him, the last remnants of the Jeanette expedition lay abandoned in the frost. Of the 33 who had set out, only 13 survived. Melville led the survivors back to civilization. He also recovered DeLong's journal, which he carried home like a sacred relic. The story, serialized in the New York Herald, shocked the American public. They had gone chasing a dream and found death on a scale no one could have imagined. But in tragedy, there was also legacy. DeLong's meticulous observations of the ice and ocean currents proved invaluable. Years later, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen would use that data to plan his own Arctic voyage aboard the Fram, a ship designed to drift safely with the pack ice. The very currents that killed DeLong helped guide future expeditions. And in an almost poetic twist, the wreckage of the Jeanette itself was found years later on the coast of Greenland, having drifted over 2,000 miles from where it sank. It was physical proof of the polar drift theory, and a haunting reminder of the distance those men had traveled, even in death. Back home, memorials were raised, streets named after the Jeanette, monuments to DeLong and his men. But their true memorial was buried in the ice, in the journals recovered from that final camp, in the simple, aching lines of a captain who refused to stop recording history even as his own life slipped away. There are stories that define courage, others that reveal the limits of human ambition. The story of the Jeanette is both. It's a reminder that the polar regions are not simply places on a map, but living forces. And when men challenge them with dreams alone, the cost can be everything. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.